Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kamwangi wash processed Kenya from Livid Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Livid, based out of Bangkok, Thailand, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel. They're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. We picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of their January coffee drop, as it felt like a great opportunity to try out our first ever Thai-based coffee roaster. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 62. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So I certainly had no idea what to expect from this coffee roaster going into it. However, upon the first impression of this coffee, I could certainly tell that it was on the more developed side of things than I usually prefer with a coffee. And even then, you can get some slightly more developed coffees from Asian-based coffee roasters, but this one I would say was still a bit more developed than what we usually experience from a lot of Asian-based coffee roasters. I wouldn't necessarily say that this one pushed all the way to that true medium side of things, but I would say that it's maybe on the slightly lighter side of that medium, if not on the more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 33, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and the coffee definitely offered a fair bit of the more developed Kenyan feel, as there's notably more development than initially expected, with a slightly toned down brightness for a Kenyan as a result. Otherwise, plenty of expected tart berry brightness and a slightly candied red fruit chew sweetness to it, which is usually the best thing that I can get from coffees that are maybe a little bit more developed when it comes to Kenyan coffees. So mixed first impression, but again, I was hoping that maybe this coffee was going to be a little lighter, not knowing what to expect from it. But we move on to day 36 as we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was offering some similar characteristics this time around, as it is really quite bold and it does have that certain robust quality that is associated with more developed coffees. In addition to that, there's a slight bit more of the smokiness coming through this time around. Chemex does seem to have helped accentuate some of those qualities, as it does hue pretty strong on the red profile and roastiness all around. So that wasn't necessarily ideal for this coffee, but we move on to day 39 as we opted for the April brewer, and the coffee does continue to be hindered by the overall development of it, as it is slightly more developed for a Kenyan coffee, which resulted in a little bit of an uneven feel to it and a bit more of a prominent roastiness this time around as well. So kind of this adjustment that we had made with the brew method didn't seem to help. Neither of the previous 2 days that we had with this coffee was even as good as that first impression. So it was definitely going to be interesting to see where we went from here, as on day 42, we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments. So higher concentration, more coarse grind, and lower temperatures. And it was the best it had been to this point, as it does help to mitigate some of the more roasty qualities to it, as a result presenting a little bit more of the Kenyan attributes in a slightly more pronounced sense, with less of the overall smoky tones to it. So a bit more pronounced of the red berry profiles in it, as it is still very much a Kenyan coffee in the way that it does present itself. Day 45, do the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's a pretty notable trade-off, as it does have less intensity and brightness for a Kenyan coffee with these adjustments, but it doesn't have the same heavier developed qualities to it either. So definitely a lot of differentiating factors when you do make that adjustment on this one. We move on to day 51 day 48, as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe. And this was the best the coffee had been to this point. And I think having some of those previous experiences where it was a little bit mixed, going back to maybe a bit more higher extraction of adjustments, did seem to help kind of highlight and accentuate those more defined Kenyan-like profiles to it, as it is slightly sweeter and a cleaner representation of the berry qualities relative to some of the earlier impressions that we did have of this coffee. However, it is still definitely marred by the overall roastiness to it, but I just felt there was better balance in this experience overall. Day 51 through the Chemex with the same adjustments or standard recipe, and the coffee did seem to have a slight resurgence the more we continued to work through it, as I think I got a little bit more acclimated to the profile of this coffee. It does have some of the cleaner attributes this time around with a nicer level of sweetness and a bit less of the roastiness. It is still present, but it's better. And once again, I think the main thing that really happened with this coffee is I had some much more clear expectations of what I was going to get every time I brewed this coffee. So I think I was just able to handle the roasty qualities of this one a little better with time. And on day 54, through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee has been slightly inconsistent as it wasn't as good this time around, offering a bit more of a herbal Kenyan presentation to it with some slightly lingering bright tart berry attributes to go with a slightly darker stone fruit plum-like scent. So in every measure of the word Kenyan coffee, that's what this coffee was, just a little bit more of a developed Kenyan overall. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the finish and acidity level 4. So even with this coffee being generally a little less intense in the overall brightness and just intensity of this coffee, both those things still scored the level 4, as I think it would be very difficult for pretty much any Kenyan coffee, even a Kenyan coffee like this, to not score level 4s for those. So definitely along those lines. And the finish also did have a little bit of that lingering smoky quality to it. So that's something that needs to be noted on that as well. We move on to the florality level 4, and it does have plenty of the classic red floral components of a Kenyan coffee. I can't quite recall what the notes they have listed on this coffee are, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did have that red floral tone to it. Definitely a lot of the hibiscus, especially given the strong herbality that was present within this coffee. Berry fruit level 4, plenty of those currants, plenty of those more tart berry attributes within this one throughout the entirety of it. I would say that even with those being relatively toned down than the majority of Kenyan coffees we review, it was still by far the most pronounced and prominent component within this coffee, complemented, of course, by the brightness that was presented to it. We move on to level 3s, and we'll start with one of the more important ones, the sweetness level 3. And I did say that the sweetness in this coffee did improve with time, but even then I wouldn't necessarily say it was justified at that level 4 mark. Plenty of these slightly more sugary red fruit characteristics presented within this one, most specifically within the stone fruit sense, but we'll get to that in a little bit as we move on to the citrus fruit level 3. A little bit more of that generic citric quality, which is something that I do associate with a lot of Kenyan coffees, and given that it was slightly marred by the development and the profile of this one wasn't necessarily quite as clean and pronounced, I wouldn't necessarily say that there was anything too specific to differentiate within the citric fruit characteristics, a bit more generic in that sense. And then the stone fruit level 3, that's where I got the majority of the sweetness from this one. As I mentioned, there is a plum-like quality to it, and that is usually one of the more enjoyable aspects of a coffee like this. In addition to that, there was a slight bit of that fruit chew characteristic, which also did play into that level 3 for the sweetness. I associate that a bit more with a cherry characteristic, so a little bit more in line with the berry components within this one. We move on, savoriness level 3, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it was a tomato-like savoriness. Usually when it comes to slightly more developed Kenyan coffees, I don't get as much of the tomato. I get a little bit more of those tea-like characteristics, and that was kind of the case with this one, as it definitely presented itself a little bit more in a savory tea-like sense. Body level 3, definitely a little bit more texture and body, though I think in theory, given the way that we brewed this coffee, the overall development and the fact that it's a Kenyan coffee, it could have been a little higher, but even then I would say perhaps slightly higher side of level 3 for the body, but plenty of texture as fully expected within this coffee. And then the final thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel, and the most important, we'll discuss it side by side with one other thing, that is the cleanliness level 3. So it was marred by two components, the first of which being that pretty, I would say, uneven citric as well as savory quality to it, but most specifically and unsurprisingly, the roastiness to it, as there were some nice defined characteristics, most specifically in the stone fruit sense and the sweetness that was presented from the berry qualities of it. But outside of that, I would say that the overall smokiness did just seem to take away from the cleanliness of this coffee in general. And you can see that with the smokiness at a level 2, and I did toy around with the idea of maybe pushing that a little bit higher, but it usually takes a lot for me to put a coffee all the way at that level 3 mark, as there are some coffees out there that in the grand scheme of things are significantly more smoky than something like this. So I decided to settle that there at that level 2 mark. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. If you've watched a lot of our Kenyan reviews, then one thing you might have noticed in the past is that I don't necessarily dislike slightly more developed Kenyan coffees. In fact, oftentimes I have a little bit of a soft spot for them, as I would honestly prefer a slightly more developed Kenyan coffee that maybe has a little bit more sweetness than a slightly more underdeveloped Kenyan coffee that has a little bit more of those tomato-like characteristics to it. That being said, this one was probably a little further along the lines than I necessarily would have liked, as I didn't get the desired level of sweetness to counteract the overall development of this coffee. That did leave it at a weird point where I said, okay, it's not necessarily the most tomato-like Kenyan coffee, but even then it's not going in the direction that I would necessarily prefer for a coffee like this. Outside of that, never necessarily been the biggest fan of Kenyan coffees in general, but there were certainly some nice characteristics to this one, which does take us into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. So this one, as mentioned, does have a little bit more of that development to it. So if that's a big selling point to you on Kenyan coffees and you really want to mitigate those more tomato-like characteristics, then I feel like this one's a pretty good fit in that sense, as it is somewhat nicely balanced by a little bit more of the darker stone fruit qualities to it in terms of that plum-like sense, while still not sacrificing any of the brightness or red berry characteristics to it. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kamwangi wash processed Kenya from Livid Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.